Welcome back to the Leading Yourself podcast. I'm very excited for today's podcast episode. One of the things that I love about doing this podcast is the amazing opportunity that I have to meet, speak to, and interview amazing people doing amazing things. And today we have one of those people here on the podcast. You are going to have the opportunity to listen to a conversation that I had with Melissa Daimler. She's the Chief Learning Officer at Udemy and the author of the book ReCulturing: Design Your Company Culture to Connect with Strategy and Purpose for Lasting Success. Melissa and I share a lot of different passions, among them learning, talent management, talent development, and culture. You are going to listen to our conversation where we talk about where is culture, what is this term that she's now introducing called reculturing, how the pandemic impacted culture, and how companies are evolving their cultures to adapt to the evolving ways of working. I hope that you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. And if you do me a favor. Go and grab a copy of Melissa's book. You can find the link to it on the show notes of this podcast episode. And now, with no further ado, let's dig into today's podcast episode. Welcome to the Leading Yourself podcast. This is your host, Carolina de Arriba. I'm an HR professional, health and fitness coach, wife, mom, and above all things, a goal-getter. In this podcast, we're going to be digging into all things leadership, professional and career development, habits, and relationships. This is a podcast for those who want to become the best version of themselves. Those who have big dreams and are willing to embrace the journey and put in the work to achieve them. My goal is to share with you the tools, tips, and tricks to help you in your journey. So let's dig into today's episode. Welcome again to the Leading Yourself podcast. As I said, today we have a really special guest. I am so excited to have Melissa Daimler today in the podcast. She is the Chief Learning Officer at Udemy and the author of this incredible book called ReCulturing, which I was fascinated about. I devoured it. I'm such a nerd on this topics, and I could identify myself with so many pieces of the book, and I'm so excited to be here talking to Melissa. Melissa, welcome to the Leading Yourself podcast.
Thank you. I'm so excited to finally be doing this. I feel like we've been talking about it for a while.
I know, and I'm so excited for our listeners because I think they are up for a treat with our conversation today. But before we talk about your book and all this topic of culture, which is so fascinating, some of our listeners might not have heard your name before or don't know much about you. Can you start just sharing a little bit about your background?
Sure.
And a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, again, I'm really excited to be here. I love that you called yourself a nerd. It's always good to be with fellow nerds. All things culture and learning. I could talk about that all day long. My background, I'll give you the brief history. I've been in tech for most of my career. So I say 20 plus, I think it's 25 plus at this point. But I've always enjoyed working in the space of what I will call systems. I got a master's degree in organizational development. So looking more holistically at the organization as a system and thinking about culture within that system and how it can drive our strategy. And same with learning has been really the focus of my career. And I feel really lucky to have had the career and journey I've had. I was at Adobe for, it seems crazy to say this now, but almost 11 years. I played different roles there. I was a people partner. So I worked directly with the business and was able to understand more about every single business line. I started the OD function there. We kind of relaunched learning. So there was a lot of great learning in general that I had there about both business and the importance of being a business leader first, regardless of the function you're in. And then I was at Twitter for 4.5 years. This is what I call the glory years. It was from 2012 to 2016. So I was there, massive growth. You know, we went from under 1,000 employees when I started to 4,500 when I left, $1 billion in revenue. We expanded globally. It was an amazing company. It was a great culture. I believe the Twitter you see now is no longer, unfortunately, but at the time it was a wonderful company, and started the learning and organizational development function from scratch. So that was just a huge experience. So those were two great cultures. And then I had the opportunity, and I can say opportunity now, go to WeWork, because I really wanted to expand. I wanted to move back to New York City. It's one of my other favorite cities, and move into a different space besides tech. So this was more in, you know, the looking at co-working spaces and real estate. And it was also at the time a unicorn. It was growing fast. And so the opportunity to be part of that was huge. I lasted a year there, and we all know the story of what happened at WeWork. And I think there were just a lot of great lessons about culture and learning that I took away from that. And then launched my own consulting business. It was only supposed to be temporary, but that turned into 4 years, because a lot of companies really wanted to learn more about culture, especially as we were all trying to navigate this pandemic. And so was able to, during that time, write ReCulturing and kind of capture all of the lessons that I've learned, the good, bad, and ugly. And now I have just such a wonderful opportunity to be the Chief Learning Officer at Udemy, and be able to meet people like you and other great customers and colleagues. And we can talk shop and share best practices, impact a product, and also be able to do internal development there as well. So that's kind of the not so brief history of me. But yeah, I mean, I would say themes are, again, you know, kind of systems thinking, culture, and learning.
It's so fascinating. And I love something that you said, that we are business people and business partners first, and then it's whatever our function or our expertise is. And I was smiling when you said that, because when people ask me, what do? I like to describe myself as a business person who happens to be in HR. And I've always been in HR, and I started in learning, and I came full circle, because now I'm in the talent management and talent development and learning space. And it's an area that has evolved so much over the last, at least since I started my career, which is also 20 years. I don't know how you feel about that, but when I say it's been 20 years, I'm like,
I know. Yeah.
Where did 20 years went?
Yeah, like it went fast.
Very fast. But a lot of things have changed, and in learning, but especially when it comes to culture, I think that there's been this like acceleration of disruption when it comes to culture, and how companies are now looking at culture differently, and giving the importance that it has, right? When in the past, culture was something that was there, and now it's something that everyone wants to build and create and shape, and just the approach is so different. And my first question to you, Melissa, is, since we're going to be talking about a lot about culture today and your book, let's start just by defining what culture is. So from your perspective and your experience, how do you define culture?
Yeah, it's such a great question to start with. And, you know, I talk about this in the book. I have so many answers to that question from so many leaders that I have worked with over the years, and they're not so great answers. You know, I think a lot of people have defined culture, and, you know, you've heard all of these, that it's the soul of the company, or it's when people are happy, or it's engagement. So there's a lot of different definitions. And in fact, before I wrote this book, I had no idea that culture as a concept, organizational culture, has been around for over 70 years. And I feel like, 70 plus years later, we still have this nebulous definition of what culture is. I think the closest version of culture that so many people have talked about is it's your values. So I like that better than most other definitions. But to me, culture is as simple as how people work. So I talk a lot about purpose, strategy, and culture. I think purpose of a company is your why. Why do you exist? Why are you doing what you're doing as an organization and as individuals? Strategy is the what, and then culture is the how. And when we can get even more specific than that, because so often I felt like as I was working inside companies, it was confusing to a lot of employees on, what does it mean when we say we're team oriented? Or what does it mean when we say, we're innovate, we have a value of innovation? And so I always wanted to take it a step further and go to those behaviors. So if I were to see you being innovative, what would you be doing? What would you not be doing? And I was actually inspired by the whole culture deck that Patty McCord and leaders at Netflix created, where they did go beyond values and listed specific behaviors in kind of what they expected from their employees. So I do believe that, ultimately culture is a verb. It's something that's active. It's not a noun. It's not static. That's a myth that I think we get wrong. Mm-hmm. And it goes beyond values. And so I'm a fan of 3, because that's all I can remember these days. But I believe that culture is made up of behaviors, processes, and practices. And so whatever behaviors you have, those then need to be embedded into all of your people processes. So you're hiring, you're onboarding, you're developing, you're rewarding, you're performance managing. And then practices like meetings, like how we communicate, the day-to-day kind of practices, to whatever extent we can include behaviors in those as well. And so when we do this, we then have an opportunity to have culture more naturally show up in the flow of work versus being kind of this separate thing on a wall or a website. Similar to, I think, how we've been talking about learning and how learning has evolved over the years, that it's not, you and I know, it's not as powerful when we define learning as this one-off kind of training experience, versus it is also a strategic lever that can help us impact the business if we use it right.
Absolutely.
So that was a very long answer to culture, but it's behaviors, processes, and practices is how I define it.
Yeah. And when I was reading your book, I really like the way you describe it, because I agree with you. I think when I started my career, and I also had a master's degree in organizational development, and when I started to work in this space of OD, and we were talking about culture, people always said, oh, culture are the values of the company. And when you ask people, where can I find the values of your company, was always this nice thing on the wall, right? And I remember, people almost memorized them, because you had an audit, and then an auditor will come and say, what are your values? And people will just recite them without knowing what it meant, or what were, to your point, the behaviors or how they were living that. And I think I'm so glad to see that has evolved so much, and that there is so much more focus on culture more holistically than just that. And how cultures really shape the company, right? I also like your trifecta of your purpose, your strategy, and the culture, because I think that sweet spot when they're all aligned and they're one all together, I think that's where companies really thrive. And you can see from the inside and out what really the culture of that company is, and how culture becomes an enabler for that company to be successful.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. And it's so interesting because as I dug more into even the idea of systems thinking, it's a system really is not the sum of the parts, but the interrelation of the parts. And so I just feel like we don't leverage the way culture connects with strategy and how purpose can give meaning to strategy and culture. So I don't think that we leverage that whole system enough. And it's interesting because I also kind of joke that Peter Drucker, the management guru, still I feel like he's somebody who's referenced quite a bit today. He famously said culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I joke that I think the two should have breakfast together, because I think that I don't think that culture is necessarily better than strategy, because let's face it, if you have a great culture, but your strategy is not great, you're not going to have a business.
Right.
But if you have a great strategy and you're not, connecting the parts of what makes a great culture and reinforcing and rewarding those behaviors in a consistent way, and developing people are going to leave. So I do think there's a huge opportunity that we keep missing out on in, figuring out how to integrate those together much more than we do today.
Yes, I can't agree more with that. Now, we talk about culture. Your book is called ReCulturing, and you introduced this concept of reculturing, which I thought was genius and so interesting and so true, because when we talk about culture, people think we need to do a culture transformation.
Yeah.
And we think about like getting the guts out and like redoing the whole thing. And you introduced this concept that I think is brilliant. Can you explain a little bit what reculturing is?
Yeah. So as I thought more about culture and I dug into some of the research and integrated that to the experiences that I had, I realized that we were talking more about it as a noun. And to your point, like I've been part of culture transformations and culture shifts, and it takes forever, and we're done after a year, and then all of a sudden we have to do it again because we've shifted again with our business. So I realized that it really is about an ongoing set of actions that we have to think about. And if you think about strategy, we don't just talk about strategy, we talk about strategizing. And especially today in this world, we have to be so much more agile in, adjusting to the external environment. We learned that the hard way in the pandemic, that I feel like every day people were not really clear on what priorities we had. And there had to be a lot of communication. So just like we're always strategizing, I think we need to constantly be looking at how we're reinforcing our culture, and are the practices that we're doing consistent with the kind of culture that we declared ourselves to be. I don't know. I've gotten a lot of questions about, do you need to reculture and kind of think about your culture differently as much as you do about strategy? Like, should there be an annual plan for this? I don't know if it's as much as your strategy, but it certainly needs to be looked at certain inflection points. And so, at Adobe, we recultured. We didn't call it that at the time, but like 3 times when I was there, when there was a change of CEO, when we had a large acquisition, when we changed our business model, we took a step back and not only looked at strategy, but also looked at, how are we working together? What kind of, we even looked at skills, like what kind of skills do we need in our leaders? And are there certain values and behaviors that we want amplified more than they are today? And so it was more of kind of an inspirational approach. And I do feel like that is a big part of reculturing, that it should be aspirational as you look at what behaviors you want to see. So I just think it's something that we need to be looking at as in an ongoing way, much more action oriented than I think how we've always historically looked at culture.
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, I think it's been so theoretical in the past, right? We see as culture as something intangible. We think about it more theoretically, more philosophically.
Yeah.
And I love this actionable component of constantly being reassessing and I think sometimes it's just the quality of the questions that you ask yourself, right? Am I, anytime there is a change in a process, is an opportunity to say, is my process aligned with my
Yeah.
culture? Is my process reinforcing the culture that I want to create?
Mm-hmm.
I see this a lot, how DEI has become a hot topic in everywhere, right? And I think most companies are thinking about DEI as part of their culture. And I think a lot of times, right, when we look at our lenses of all our people processes, like looking at it from that lens of, is this reinforcing the inclusive culture that we want? Is this, and that for any component of culture, right? Is that ongoing questioning, not necessarily this massive effort, never ending, that becomes, I always say, don't let any effort in culture, in improving your culture, evolving your culture, and now I'm going to use the term reculturing, the flavor of the month.
Yes.
I think that's the worst thing that you can do, because then you lose the trust of people that, we're going in the right direction. This is aligned. We're doing it for the right reasons. If it just becomes the flavor of the month.
I totally agree with you. And it's so interesting. I'm happy to see, to your point, a lot of DEI efforts being more integrated into organizations and not be seen as, kind of the role of one, or I also, I'm not a big believer in one person owning culture either. And, I remember even when I was at Twitter, like we were talking about, we got to bring in an unconscious bias training. And I said, no, because I don't want that to be seen as just a checkbox of, if we do that, then we've checked the box for being diverse and inclusive. And it wasn't until I was talking to Jack, who was the CEO at the time, and he said, no, this is actually the first step toward an integrated set of actions that we're going to be taking. And we're going to start as the executive team first, which was huge. I mean, that was just a huge shift versus like rolling out a bunch of unconscious bias training. So I do think, a systems approach, and really, I love what you said about, anytime we're making a process change, pausing and really thinking about, how does this reinforce our values and behaviors and what we're trying to drive here strategically?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Now, you mentioned the pandemic as we were talking about the concept of reculturing, and I think the COVID-19 pandemic had a big influence in this topic of culture. A lot of companies, we all moved to remote working unless there was essential workers involved. And it just created this huge change. And we had the need to adapt. But that had a big impact in companies' cultures, to the point that today, even though we were talking before we started the interview about COVID still a thing, but it's not the thing that it was when we were in 2020, 2021. But companies are trying to figure out, what is the post-pandemic work life looks like, right? Mm-hmm. What is the future of work? What is the new norm? We use all these terms. And I think it all comes back to companies trying to identify, what is their culture and how does this fit in their culture? Can you talk a little bit about the impact that an event like the pandemic had in company culture, and some of the things that you've seen from your experience in this regard?
Yeah, I feel lucky. I mean, this is what I would say is a silver lining from the pandemic, in that it has amplified the need to look at culture beyond ping pong tables and happy hours. Because I think we sometimes, even going back to those awful definitions, like sometimes people even think about culture as those things that happen at work in an office. And we know that's not what culture is. Those things are great. I love them. I loved the free donuts we had at Twitter. But that's not that just it does culture a disservice if we think that's all it is. So I think, taking the office out of it has allowed us to think differently about what culture is in a hybrid world. And it allows us to then think about some of the things we've talked about, which is culture is created in every conversation. It is strengthened or weakened in every decision we make. Because it really is how we work with each other. And those things those practices that even I relied on as a manager, like following up with somebody in a hallway, like, oh my gosh, I forgot to talk to you about, this decision, and you need to do this, or I wasn't that clear about objectives on this piece, or what it is we're trying to do here, or whatever it may be. I feel like we have to be much clearer about everything we do now, because so much of what we're doing is virtual. We don't have the luxury of those hallway conversations. So clarity, intentionality are just part of our everyday work. And that starts with being really clear about your strategy and your culture. And what expectations do I have of you in what you're working on and how you're working on it, so that, I don't have to have 15 Zoom calls with you all day long. I just know that we're aligned, we're clear, and, you're doing what you need to be doing. So I think it's definitely impacted how we look at culture in a positive way.
Yeah, I think there were, for me, great things that the pandemic brought. One, accelerated a lot of the things that companies were trying to do anyways, right? That we procrastinated because there was always other priorities, because we didn't have the time to work on them, or it was an HR initiative versus a part of the company culture, and it accelerated a lot of those things. I think for me also reinforced a lot of the values and the behaviors, to your point earlier, right? Like, I don't know, but for me, things like empathy, vulnerability, like these are things that I think I personally experienced at a different level during the pandemic time, right? And even now, like being super intentional about scheduling time with people and talking and aligning and finding, I don't know, I always say that when you're thrown at the water without knowing how to swim, you figure out how to swim. And that's what the pandemic did for a lot of things. And yeah, we're still trying to find out what hybrid looks like and what does that mean. And a lot of companies are trying to figure that out. Now, I want to ask you a follow-up question to that. I have had conversations with colleagues, with peers in the industry, this conversation about remote work or hybrid work is eroding our culture. We need to get back to the office. And we've seen big companies, talking about Twitter, for example, right? And I know that's a different Twitter than the Twitter that you were when you were there, but a lot of companies are moving to, we need to go back to the office, and because it's eroding our culture. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. It's so funny. I'm smiling because so many leaders, and, some at Udemy are saying, how do we get our culture back? This was pre our whole ReCulturing, mind you, because we're going through a ReCulturing process as well. And it's just code for how do we get people back into the office? And it's the wrong question. And so I do think that we need to be really intentional about the hybrid strategy. Like, what we need to be consistent. I think some companies are leaving it up to the manager to have, some flexibility, which normally is a good thing. But in this case, I think managers need a little bit more air cover and guidance in how to address this with their employees. And so, I can't remember what article I read recently, but they were talking about how the office should be used as yet another tool. I think we get in trouble when we bifurcate, people coming into the office are good and people not in the office are bad. The people coming into the office are helping build culture. The people who aren't in the office aren't. So that's just an old way of thinking. And I'm wondering if that's partly just because many of those folks just aren't familiar with working in the space. And some of us crave, like, I love the office. The office is very close to where I live. So it's easy for me to go in. I love wearing heels again. I like, wearing something other than Lululemon. It's great. I love seeing people and the informal conversations, and half of my team is not anywhere close to our office. And so we have to remember, even when some of us are in the office and some of us are virtual, we have to lean toward the virtual tools. We were in a meeting the other day, and there's a whiteboard, newly cleaned, brand new markers behind us. And we were half of us, there were 4 of us in the room, we're super excited to kind of get on that whiteboard. And then we realized 3 people on our team were calling in to Zoom, and we had to use Miro because that was the tool that level set everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And so we just need to work differently. And it ended up being great anyway, because then it could record, we were able to do more things. But I think we really need to be, going back to our word, intentional about what our strategy is and why. So if we use the office as a tool for things like brainstorming or coming together for major decisions that are easier to make, in person versus virtually, instead of just saying, I want people back in the office because I just think, collaboration is a good thing or more work gets done, that's not a good reason. So I think, to your point, we still have a lot of learning to do there, and companies are still figuring this out, but people need a reason to come into the office other than free sandwiches.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the intentionality piece is, for me, the most important thing, right? And how can we create a pool that people want to be there because they see the value of being there? They see that decisions are made easier, or they get to talk to people that otherwise they don't, or whatever that is, but they see a value of going to the office versus feeling that they have to go because they've been told to go to the office, right?
Yeah.
And I think, as I was reading your book, I'm thinking, also thinking about, to your point before, how is this supporting our culture? And if we start by, as you said, this aspirational view of our culture, then we can reverse engineering and said, okay, in order to have this thriving culture, whatever thriving means for whatever company, this is how work needs to happen. And then we can build that around that versus getting into the location of where work happens.
Totally.
I think, the pandemic came to disrupt a lot of things, but I think in a positive way, to an extent, it got us thinking differently. It got us to think possibilities where we didn't see them before. Like, I would have never imagined that I was going to be working from home every day.
Me neither.
That wasn't on my vision. That it's never crossed my mind. Like, my entire career has been, you wake up, you go to work, and you're at work for 8, 9, 10 hours, whatever that time is, and then you go home, right? But it never crossed my mind that I would be working remotely. And how that just changes the way you approach things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, we talk about it a lot at Udemy, and one of the things that we're realizing that a lot of other companies are realizing is that we're not necessarily set up with an office that encourages brainstorming or collaboration. So if you're just coming to the office to go sit down at a computer and do Zoom calls all day, and not really interact with people, then what was the point? Versus, companies like Cloudflare, for instance, are, kind of rethinking what the office space is. They just redid their space so that I think, of course, the big ones did it too. Google did it, but like even uh, companies other than the ones we would typically think of, they created beautiful sofas with big screens so that they could collaborate with whoever is there in person as well as remotely. They broke down a lot of the individual desks, and they created pods for people to work asynchronously together. So if they wanted to do kind of sprints or whatever, they could do that. And it'd be easier to kind of say, hey, what are you working on? Or I have a question about this, versus kind of getting on a Zoom call. They have, I think, what they call Zoom rooms. So like just one person Zoom rooms, where you tap one button and, somebody pops on the call. So, we need to rethink, how we're working. And again, how we can use the office as a tool that helps do some of the things that you and I are talking about here: the collaboration, the brainstorming, the decision making, reasons to come together. So how do we create an environment where we can support that and people see why I go to the office versus stay at home in my kitchen or living room or wherever.
Yeah. Now, I talk to people that, are starting to go more to the office, and I always hear the stories like, oh, I saw this person that I haven't seen in so long, and I catch up with that other person, and I got this thing done. And I'm thinking, your day was completely different than it would have been if you were working from home.
Mm-hmm.
And you got a ton of value on you being in the office. Let's capitalize on that, right? Versus where did the work happen, or whether today I'm home or today I'm in the office. I don't know. I work all the time from home, and I wish I had an office near me. I think there's so much value, and to your point, that physical connection, that interaction, that collaboration. And I think the good thing is that we're kind of finding a balance between all of those things in a way that we can maximize each of the spaces, each of the ways of collaboration, versus just having one. Now we have diversity of ways that we can connect, and diversity of ways that we can collaborate and innovate and all of those things. So, but at the same time, I think there's an added layer of complexity, right? When you have like hybrid teams or things like that, like how do you make sure, if, for example, we say we want a culture that is inclusive, and in your example, before half of the team is in one room and half of the team is remote, how do you make sure that those that are remote are feeling included in the conversation? And I think that sometimes is also challenging, right? Like if you're in the phone, you're trying to speak over everyone else that is speaking at the same time. And it's funny, like our challenges are so different than what they were before the pandemic. In a good way. I think it's challenging us in a good way.
Yeah. And I think to your point, these challenges were there before, right? Like we were looking at how to make sure we were including everybody in meetings anyway. I just think now we're much more aware of that, with some people being remote or everybody being remote. I think we have, I'll give you an example. We have a value of always learning, not a surprise. And we went through a recent ReCulturing exercise, and one of the behaviors that we landed on and we realized with learning was constructively debating each other. And so we realized that part of learning was making sure we had diverse voices, and that we were able to feel safe in debating a point of view. So one of the things that we've realized with that is we don't have the skills to constructively debate. So we're actually building a whole kind of learning experience for how to help people across you to me to feel more comfortable constructively debating. But we make sure in every meeting there's at least one person who is mindful of that, like, and is watching for people who might be hesitant, or even those little micro actions, like that I never was aware of before, like on Zoom when you're on mute, but then you see somebody go off mute, and so you can say, hey, I just saw that you went off mute. Did you want to say something, or did you have a different perspective? And so there's so many different ways to teach each other, teach our managers, give people the tools to exemplify those values and behaviors and whatever those are, even virtually. I think Adam Grant, in one of his podcasts, is even saying that his experience has been, he almost feels like it's a more inclusive experience on Zoom than in the classroom, because he is able to, kind of see the chat going, like people are chatting when maybe they wouldn't be able to kind of express themselves as much, and be able to see when people are nodding or when people are not engaged as much. So I think if we, approach these things with an open mind and think differently, and use our values and behaviors to help us build our hybrid strategies, I think it's going to be a lot easier than just kind of thinking, when are we going to go back to normal? Because we're not going to go back. We don't want to go back. How many people complained about how it was before anyway?
Right?
Yeah.
And what a great opportunity we have to create the new normal, right? It's
right.
like,
we will never have this opportunity again in our lifetime.
Agree. It's like, yeah, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity to disrupt and create something the way that we feel is the most valuable to us and connects most to who we are and our purpose, and again, what we're doing and what we want to do. Yes. So Melissa, I want to be respectful of time, and I can be talking with you for hours. I feel like, I love this. Before we wrap up, I have just two more questions. One is there anything that we didn't touch on that you think can be valuable in terms of culture for people that are thinking about, okay, how do I get started with this? Like, how do I know even if I need to make changes in my culture, or like, how can people get started if they want to think about or be more intentional about reculturing? Where to start?
Yeah. Well, buy the book. No, I'm kidding.
And we will put the link to the book on the show notes of the podcast. You definitely should grab a copy. It's totally worth reading.
Thank you. I do, it's funny because when your publisher comes to you and says, hey, who's your target audience? The no is to say, I have multiple audiences. And I did say initially it is for leaders, of course, people leaders, all leaders, frankly. And I do believe it's for all employees. I mean, part of why I wanted to write this is because I wanted to give agency to every employee to realize that you have the power, more than you realize, to shift culture and to continue to build and strengthen the culture. So I think, first of all, if you're not clear on what your culture is and not clear about, what your values are, start there, ask questions. If you have a list of values, think about, what behavior, how do you know? Like, what behaviors would somebody be doing? Like when somebody thinks about my performance, and, one of the values is teamwork, what are you looking for in my performance? So I think starting with those questions matters. So that's really important. I also believe that having as few behaviors as possible is really important, 10 or fewer. We got to 15 at Udemy, and I think we're going to narrow that a little bit more, because it's not about memorizing. It's more about integrating it into processes and practices. And then, I would say we didn't get into this as much, but I think having a consistent set of skills across an organization is really important, and tied to your values and behaviors is nirvana. And because I think if you have things like constructive debate as one of your behaviors that you can then reinforce and teach people how to do, again, regardless of level, tenure, function, geography, it is such a much more motivating way to learn when I know my colleagues are learning similar skills. And I know if I'm learning that, I'm helping to build the culture. And so I just think mapping your learning strategy for, the all employee learning strategy of skills to your culture, your values and behaviors is such a, it's an important part of, I think, a healthy organization.
Yeah, I can agree more. And I think, we didn't talk about skills at all, but we could do a whole podcast episode on skills, because that is the direction we're all going to, right? We're moving from jobs to skills, from, all these things. And then skills are becoming the paramount of everything that we do, right? And really the currency on human capital. It's skills nowadays. And as companies are transforming and all companies are becoming more digital and they're trying to disrupt the market, like, I don't know anyone that I've talked to in any industry that their companies are not going through some sort of a transformation in their products, in their strategies, in their services, in the go-to markets, because they're being forced to do that. And with that comes, okay, how are we reskilling? How are we focusing on what are those skills that are going to help us make that transition?
Right.
And then how that connects with culture. So I think I agree. That is the nirvana. I don't know who has cracked that code. I think we're all trying to crack that code. But I love what you said, that anyone in the organization impacts culture. This is not your head of HR. This is not the president of your company or the board. Is everyone. And if it requires everyone to create a culture, not one person can influence or create a culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So to close out, if people are like, I want more, I want to learn more about this topic, of course, grab the book. We're going to put the link on the show notes so you can easily find the book and grab a copy. Totally worth it. How can people find you, connect with you? What are some ways that they can learn more about this topic?
Sure. So I have a website, melissadaimler.com, that you can go to. And I've now just started to get over my writer's block from writing a book last year. And I'm doing a monthly newsletter. So you can sign up to hear from me on at least a monthly basis. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. So you can find me there, Melissa Daimler. I also dabble in Instagram. So M Daimler on there. So would love to hear how it's going for everybody, and any questions you have. In addition, I'd be happy to answer.
Yeah, that's great. And this is, I think, also a great book to do a book club. If you have, even within your company, your department, your friends, it's an easy read. It has lots of examples that I think everyone can relate with. The concepts, I like to say, is written in plain English. I think that even that person that doesn't have a master's degree in OD or a PhD in psychology, like, they can understand, like, it's written for everyone. And that's one thing that I love about your book, like the examples you give, how simple it is. And it's simple, but it's so impactful, right? You tie concepts together that it just makes sense. And it's like, you start to have a lot of aha moments as you're reading the book. So really recommend everyone to grab a copy.
Thank you. I mean, that again was one of the reasons I wrote it, is because I just felt like so many research articles and books and papers out there were so theoretical, and they weren't from the operator, the person inside the company. So I really wanted it to be an easy read. I was reminded as I was writing the book that hard writing makes for easy reading. Easy writing makes for hard writing, because we've all had those books where it seemed really good, the title was good, and then you start reading it, it's really, you can't follow it. So it was very hard for me to write. So I'm glad that it's an easy read.
Well, Melissa, thank you so much for being here today. It was such a pleasure. As I said, I could talk to you for hours. I really appreciate you joining us on the podcast. Such an honor to have you here today.
Wow. Thanks for chatting. I mean, that flew by. So I really appreciate the conversation.
Yes. Let me stop recording.